Amid global outrage over atrocities in Ukraine, the U.S. and allies are announcing new sanctions to punish Russia that include penalties on Russian President Vladimir Putin's daughters.
Yeah, the U.S. Secretary of State is in Brussels meeting with European leaders as pressure mounts on President Biden to do more to help Ukraine and stop Russia's war. Alice Barr with more.
As evidence grows of Russian atrocities against Ukrainian civilians, the U.S. and allies are toughening their sanctions on the Russian economy.
There's nothing less happening than major war crimes. Responsible nations have to come together to hold these perpetrators accountable.
President Biden today rolling out a ban on all new investment in Russia, increased penalties on financial institutions and state-owned companies, and sanctions on government officials and their families, including Russian President Vladimir Putin's adult daughters.
We're going to keep raising the economic cost and ratchet up the pain for Putin.
The Biden administration also sending an additional $100 million worth of Javelin anti-tank missiles to arm Ukraine.
Advanced weapons and ammunition are flowing in every single day.
In an NBC News exclusive, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Brussels for NATO meetings offering this context.
For every Russian tank in Ukraine, we have provided or will soon provide 10 anti-tank systems.
And amid a painful and painstaking effort to gather evidence of Russian war crimes, the Secretary promising justice, however long it takes.
There will be a relentless effort to make sure that those responsible for what we're seeing are held accountable.
Ukrainian officials say the brutal killings in the Kyiv suburb of Bucha are not the exception, as Russian troops withdraw from other parts of the country and reveal more civilian deaths. The U.S. Department of Justice today laid out new actions it's taking against Russia, including unsealing an indictment charging a Russian oligarch with evading sanctions. The DOJ also now working with European allies to investigate potential Russian war crimes. In Washington, Alice Barr, NBC News.